We're looking at the image and likeness of God. And during the first session, we simply looked at how we experience that, experientially, but where it comes from in Scripture. What I want to do in the second part is I want to look at our struggles with that. This is the greatest, it's the root of all our greatness, but it's also the root of almost all of our struggles. It comes to us in a very mixed way. We have all this divine madness inside of us, and madness by definition pushes you towards greatness. It also pushes you towards addictions and all kinds of other things. So what I want to do this hour is I want to look at just our struggles, what this does inside of us. And I want to do it in two parts. I want to look a little bit just at our naivete about the image and likeness of God inside of us, both personally and oftentimes in our spiritualities. But then I want to break it down into how do we experience this as struggle in our lives. I think it's really important to be able to name that. There's a bit of a little gathering here. I want to read you a piece from Henry Nouwen, who used to have this great talent just to give these wonderful sound bites. In one of his books, just in 2 paragraphs, he talked about the tension we have in our lives between being filled yet unfulfilled. That our lives are full, but at a certain point they're empty. So he writes this way, he says, filled. One of the most obvious characteristics of our lives is that we are busy. We experience our days as filled with things to do, people to meet, projects to finish, letters to write, calls to make, appointments to keep. Our lives often seem like overpacked suitcases that are bursting at the seams. In fact, we are always aware of being behind schedule. There is a nagging sense that there are unfinished tasks, unfulfilled promises, unrealized proposals. There's always something else we should have remembered, done, or said. There are always people we didn't speak to, write to, or visit. Therefore, although we are very busy, we have a lingering feeling of never fulfilling our obligations, unfulfilled. However, beneath our worrying lives, something else is going on. While our minds and hearts are filled with many things, and we wonder how we can live up to all these expectations imposed on us by ourselves and others, we have a deep sense of unfulfillment. While busy with and worried about many things, we seldom feel truly satisfied, at peace, or at home. There's a gnawing sense of being unfulfilled, which lies deep underneath our filled lives. Reflecting a little more on this experience of unfulfillment, we can discern different sentiments. The most significant are boredom, resentment, and depression. Let's look at that. I want to look at the image and likeness of God, which is this wonderful energy, power. It's what makes us a human being inside of us, but as a source of struggle. And I want to first talk about our naivete about that, and then we'll talk about the struggle that it is. First of all, our naivete. I kind of said it during the first hour, but I want to highlight a couple of things about it. And that is, see, when we fantasize or think about, I'm made in God's image and likeness, we tend to think of that, as I said this morning, just as kind of this beautiful icon, somewhere there's a holiness or a sacredness stamped inside of you. And that's true. That's true. But we don't think of it as, wow, what am I going to do with this energy? How am I going to play this out and just live as a normal, kind of happy human being? It's not just the beautiful icon inside of us, it's divine fire. God is fire. God is light. God is divine energy. We have that inside of ourselves. Now, we tend to be very naive about it in 2 different ways. First of all, naivete about its power. Divine madness is the real source of our discontent, our addictions, our narcissism, our jealousy, and our dysfunctions. It's the real source of our complexity. Let me talk about that. Begin with kind of I can tell it with a smile on my face. But, I grew up in rural Saskatchewan. That was a wonderful experience. Farming, this farming area like you see it on television. And we'd always get these wonderful parish priests when I was a kid. And they'd come out to our little parish and say, God, it's just wonderful to be with you. these simple farm folk here in the prairies. And I'd always think he watched too many episodes of Little House on the Prairies. Notice the naivete in that, and I don't want to pick on these priests because we often, these simple farm folk, they're out there with nature, they don't have any problems. I thought, little does this guy know, There are no simple farm folk because there aren't any simple folk, period. We're all complex. And, I lived in that area and farmers committed suicide and they did all kinds of other things because they're as complicated as everybody else. Nobody's simple or uncomplex. And sometimes in spirituality, we haven't picked up on that we just struggle with that. First of all, how we understand spirituality and great figures inside of spirituality, then last of all, how we understand ourselves. That's why, for instance, when anybody, theologian, for instance, writes a book on Jesus and would say, okay, Jesus, we believe Jesus was fully human, that Jesus had sexual temptations or he was sexually complex. There's 100 people want to crucify this guy on the spot. Or that we could never admit that. See, Mother Teresa would struggle. No, she's Mother Teresa. Or this is Jesus. These are great figures. As if they don't have complexity, and as if they don't have sexual complexity and human complexity. Everybody has it. There are no simple farm folk, and there wasn't any simple Jesus, and there wasn't any simple Mother Teresa, and there is no simple you. There's nobody simple. Remember, as a young seminarian, I wish I'd written down who said it. That was so liberating. I was reading the old Critic magazine. I don't know if it's still being, but in Critic magazine, I'm reading this article. I'm like 19 or 20, and this was revelatory to me. This guy says, do you ever feel that you're neurotic, oversexed, dissatisfied, perennially not right in life? He said, if you do, he says, cheer up. It just means you aren't in clinical depression, and you're normal. And he wasn't just kidding. What's the first sign of clinical depression? Precisely when all this complexity goes out. We just lie in bed and say, I don't want to get up. I don't want to comb my hair. I don't have a reason to do anything. I just want to lie here, take beer by intravenous or something. There's no reason to move. See, the fire goes out. It's clinical depression. Where we're not clinically depressed, a sign of emotional health and spiritual life and human health is we're complex. And we need to know that about ourselves. And spiritualities in the past, I think I can say that sympathetically, haven't always been, they've been naive about this. And they haven't given you permission to be who you are, which is a complex person. And particularly, I don't want to only pick on that area, particularly in your sexuality. Sexuality is an immensely complex power. And next to your instinct for breathing, it's the strongest instinct inside of you to pretend it's not there. It's never an issue. No, we're not doing ourselves or anybody else's service. Doesn't mean we act out on it. But we have to recognize how complex we are. It's not easy being a human being. It's not easy being you. And it's not easy being Mother Teresa, and it wasn't easy being Jesus. And none of them are simple. There are no simple farm folk. There was no simple Jesus. There is no simple Mother Teresa, and there is no simple you. And when you're in touch with yourself, you know that. We're complex. And we're complex to a part, and don't even be afraid to admit that where at times we can scare ourselves. And in fact, we do. That's why so often we struggle to go into silence. We struggle to go into solitude. We struggle to face the deep parts of ourselves, which in the end are friendly. As Thomas Merton says, in the end, trust what's deep inside of you, but they're so deep that it's scary. It's really scary to let yourself sink into the deepest recesses of your heart and so on, because there's many levels. You're a Grand Canyon without a bottom. And once you start free falling in there, you're falling a long, long ways, okay? But that's who we are. And it's the best part of us. You have divinity inside of you. Divinity isn't simple, and we shouldn't be naive about that. Now, secondly, we should also then shouldn't be naive and over-pious about, I want to do a little piece on this, because again, in spirituality, we don't treat this well, and we suffer from it, and that is about, don't be simplistic about the notion of ego. See, we have this simplistic idea that ego is bad. He's an egotist. That's all ego. This is ego and so on. Well, first of all, that's far, far too simple. First of all, the word ego of itself is neutral. It can be bad. It can be good. Ego is very necessary. Ego is, but it saves you from becoming psychotic. You need a strong ego. That's the center of your self-awareness and so on. And also you need a strong ego if you're ever going to do anything worthwhile. And again, we have naive, denial things. Now, I hope these examples won't shock you because I mean them in the best and sense, you know. You know, people like, for instance, Mother Teresa. Do you think there was any ego there? Powerful ego. Now, she wasn't an egotist. But we go, oh, this humble little Mother Teresa. Nonsense. She was humble and little, but she was a ball of fire. Mother Teresa could walk into any room, and she did, and kind of, I'm an important spiritual figure carrying an important message, and she was. That's not humility. Most of us can't pull that off. You know, a lot of our problems sometimes we're not going to be great men and women, even spiritually, because we don't have enough ego. It's just, well, humble little me, I don't know, you know. John Paul II, you think there was any ego there? Tons of it. And it had to. He was a great man, but John Paul could go in front of 4 million people and say, I love you. It's very important you hear this from me. I can't do that. You know, I don't have enough ego, and I don't have his greatness. You and I can't do that. Well, who am I? Do you think that, you know, the world even cares where I love them or whatever? See, that's all lack of ego, and oftentimes it hampers us, and it frustrates us, and it's the source of rage and so on. Like Mother Teresa, John Paul, those were great people. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, those were great people. They had huge egos. Now, they weren't necessarily egotistical. That's something else. See, egotism, whenever you have the word ism on a word, it's usually bad, you know. So that ego is good, egotism isn't good. See, what precisely made their greatness, and that's the passage I read to you from Nelson Mandela, where he says, playing small doesn't serve the world, it doesn't serve God, and it isn't true. You're not some, you know, accidental chip that fell off, you know, the conveyor belt of evolution. You are special. And it is important for the world to hear that you love them. John Paul could do that. It was part of his greatness. He could go in front of the world and say, I love you, and it's very important you hear this from me. You know, most of us in the room, we couldn't do that. Our tongue would break off. We'd shrink and shrivel and fall through the floor, you know. That's why he was a great man, and we aren't that great, you know, and I say that sympathetically, you know. So you know, we need to clarify that. So we're often not helped by our spiritualities and spiritual directors and spiritual guides, and be careful, careful, careful. You're going to see we need to be careful, but we need to be equally careful about false humility as we need to be about ego. It's true. Most of our spiritual books are true, but they're one-sided. They're saying, careful, careful, careful. And you're going to see in a few minutes, we really need to be careful because this energy isn't friendly, and this energy can kill you. It can eat you up real easily. But at the same time, if you don't do it right, you're going to end up in chronic depression and chronically enraged and all kinds of other problems. You have to be in touch with this energy. And you have to have enough ego or you'll never do anything worthwhile. If you have too much, you're going to inflate and become destructive. It's a fine line. But our spiritualities and the way we've been raised, we haven't been given permission to even look at that. And then consequently, you know, we project falsity on our great figures. You know, that's why we can't project complexity onto Mother Teresa or John Paul or Jesus. We can't project ego onto them either. You know, well, Mother Teresa can't have an ego. She's a saint. No, she was a saint, but she had an ego, and a huge one. You can't project ego onto John Paul. No, he may well be a saint, but he had a huge ego. That's part of what made him a great person. I don't even want to. I still can't pronounce the word and apply it to Jesus. You know, but see, they had a sense precisely of their blessedness. Mother Teresa had a clear sense. I'm God's blessed one. And she was. John Paul, I'm God's blessed one. And he was. You and I are also God's blessed one. But oftentimes, we simply can't step up. And as I'm going to say in a few minutes, we're going to pay a huge price for that. And the price is, you know, anybody who says, well, I'm this humble person, that's always a lie, and they know it. And whenever somebody does that, underneath there's always an enraged person. There's always a real angry, enraged god or goddess underneath there who is not hearing this at all. Because you know you're special. You know it. And every fiber of your being knows it. You know, no, I'm just this humble piece, you know, computer chip that fell. I mean, off the evolutionary conveyor belt and so on. No, that's a lie. You know it, and there's a part of you that's really enraged and bitter and depressed because of that. Notice Mother Teresa or John Paul, you ever in a room with them? You know, they lit it up like a light bulb. Mother Teresa walked in, it was like somebody turned on a heater, a light. You know, energy came out of them. Now we find out later that for the last 60 years of her life, Mother Teresa was living in this huge dark night of the soul. She never radiated that outside for a second. Oh, his energy, she's God's chosen one. You know, she could walk and hear God say to her, "You're my beloved one, in whom I'm well pleased." You know, see, that takes some ego. You and I don't have enough ego in this room. I'll come back on that. That's the first naivete, about its power and its importance. Secondly, now a little bit in reverse, we shouldn't be naive about its friendliness. You know, Carl Jung, the great psychologist, was the first person who said that so clearly. Jung used to say, the greatest naivete, and Jung was a liberal, so he's picking on his own kind. He says, the greatest naivete in the liberal community, all around, both psychologically, spiritually, is they think energy is friendly, and it's not. That's quite a line. So the greatest liberal naivete is liberals. We think energy is friendly, and it's not. What does he mean by that? Well, this. I'm going to give you one single example. See, it's hard to get energy turned on. You know, if you've ever tried to write or paint or do anything creative and so on, it's not that easy to access energy. But you know what's harder than accessing it? Getting it shut off once you get it on. You can't turn energy off like a valve, and it'll knock you all over the planet. It's going to beat you up like the playground bully. And what does he mean by that? The next time you can't sleep at night, you'll know what. It's just got stuff going on. See, energy is powerful. Energy is beyond us. You got to be careful about it. I want to give you one example of that, and a strong one, but a good one. And that's what's wrong with pornography. See, I want to give you, in strident liberalism, a bad argument that sounds so convincing. So you'll get liberals arguing, they'll say, we're just too uptight about sex. There's nothing wrong with pornography. Sex is the most beautiful thing God created on this planet, so why are we uptight about watching it? Well, how do you answer that? That's quite an argument. Sex, it's true, it's the most beautiful thing God created, and so why are we uptight about watching it? Well, Jung would give the answer, because the energy's too powerful, it's godly, that's exactly why it shouldn't be watched. I'll give you an example. And I used that in The Holy Longing, but some years ago in Canada, I was watching a CBC summer program, some of their local programming, and it's a bit of a risk. Sometimes, this stuff is a little off the wall, and sometimes it's utterly brilliant, and this was a brilliant piece. And it was, kind of a home box office, movie made to be watched once on television. And it was the story of these 4 couples in Ontario, in Toronto, and they were just between 40, around 50 years old, and their kids were just kind of growing now. And they had been college friends in the same setting in college, so they decided, the 4 couples, that they would spend a month or 6 weeks, and they would rent these Winnebagos, and they'd drive across Canada and recapture and just celebrate they're all turning 50. So they rented these Winnebagos, and they're all still, 50s, pretty young, and they're healthy, and now the kids can take care of themselves for the summer, and they drive out. And the first couple of days, this went really well. They'd come to campsites at night, and they'd drink red wine and cognac, and the men would smoke some big cigars and barbecue some steaks, and this is great, 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 great. Till about the 4th night, and they get to a little place called Gimli, Manitoba, which is outside of Winnipeg, and they're at a campground. It's a Friday night. They've just had their barbecue and their red wine, and they're celebrating and so on. And about midnight, they get woke up, and these young college-type kids descend on this campground, and they have this wild orgy, and kids are having sex under trees and all this type of stuff. And these middle-aged couples, they're kind of pulls them together in a circle really quickly. Oh, wow, this is something, Watch it. You know something? It ruins their trip. It ruins the trip. From there on, they're snippy with each other, they're out of sorts, they don't know why, there's a depression and so on. That's actually a brilliant insight. That's exactly. You know why pornography's wrong? Not because sex isn't the most beautiful thing God made. Precisely, you know what they were seeing in that campground, archetypally? They were seeing Eros and Aphrodite making love under a tree. And that's beautiful, it's not to be watched. hang on to this line. You can write a book on this line. But when Moses is up on the mountain first time, and he wants to see the face of God. See, they had this whole motif. What does God look like? And Moses begs God, I want to see your face. And God said, you can't see my face because nobody can see the face of God and live. Nobody can see the face of God and live. The next time someone says to you, what's wrong with pornography? Tell them, nobody can see the face of God and live. It's not that the energy is not meant to be watched. It's too powerful. And then why do you get depressed? Because it precisely overstimulates your grandiosity. It overstimulates the divine part of you. And then the only way you can, unless you're going to immediately act out sexually all over the planet, you only have one choice. You turn on the cooling jets, like in a nuclear power plant, and it cools everything off. And while you're sizzling under that cooling stuff, that's called an adaptive depression. You know, that's what pornography does. Pornography depresses people because it has to. You know, it'll either turn them into monsters and psychosis, or it's going to cause immense depression. See, and oftentimes we don't get that. You know, that wonderful, naive argument. It's beautiful, so why can't you watch it? Well, that's what Moses is telling God. You're beautiful, why can't I see you? You know, no, you can't. Nobody can see the face of God and live. See, so this powerful energy inside of us and around us, it's got to be handled gingerly. And that's where the old spiritual books that I just wrapped 5 minutes ago and said they didn't give us permission about this, but on this part they were right. One of the reasons why they didn't give us permission is because they were so concerned about the second part, that the key word was always caution, 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 careful, careful, careful. And part of that is really correct. Now, the other part is you also have to say, however, you also have to access this. But see, the old spiritual books precisely were so timid, and they were so rigid at times precisely around the area of sexuality, because their instinct was right. The instinct was really right. The instinct was careful, careful, careful. This is not a power you can play with lightly. You know, it's got to be surrounded with the right insulation, with the right kind of filters, with the right kind of maturity, and so on. You know, and we still need to do that. You know, in our culture, we have, for instance, I always laugh when I hear this expression because it's an oxymoron. They talk about safe sex. That's an oxymoron. You know, maybe if you're married for 40 years, there'd be some safety in sex. You know, see, when they say safe sex, they're talking about safe in terms of contraceptive and disease, but sex is never safe emotionally, except in certain situations of fidelity and so on. See, because it's not that it's bad, it's this wonderful godly power. Be careful, be careful. You know who gets this, understands this? Electricians. If there's an electrician in here, you'll get it. And that is, give you a simple analogy. When you go outside, and sometimes you'll see across fields, you'll see these big power lines, and there's 15 of them up there, and there's about 50,000 volts in every one of those wires. Well, you can't hook one of those wires up to your house. They'll burn the house down. You need a transformer. And this transformer takes those 50,000 volts and it puts them into voltage that can light your house and turn the heat on, and you can run a stove and so on. Electricians know that. You can't just hook yourself directly to that power. It needs filters. It needs to be, and that's the face of God. Nobody can see the face of God and live. You know, the electrician will tell you nobody can touch one of those wires and stay alive. Incidentally, as an aside, that's what's wrong with cults. You know why cults are dangerous? Because they're real. What cults are really, in terms of an image, is like somebody's taking a knife and sticking it into a 220 plug and saying, I wonder what that's going to feel like. Well, you will feel it, clearly. And that's why it's no accident. Notice that most cults, that this isn't even made up. I mean, it's true. Most cult people die how? In fires. The true David Koresh, the Solar Temple cult. You know, why? God is fire, and they're trying to touch God without filters. Careful with energy. We have godly energy. That's why the energy inside of us, whether it's our sexual energy, our creative energy, and so on, it's got to be accessed, as I want to say in a few minutes. Or we go into depression and rage and so on, but it's got to be accessed correctly. If we don't access it correctly, it's going to kill us, or it's going to do bad things to us. It'll depress us. And actually, depression is the happier of all the options, as you'll see. Okay, so that's the first point. Our struggle, we may not be naive about it. Okay. Don't be naive about the fact that it's something you have to access. It's making you a complicated person. Your life isn't simple. Your spiritual life isn't going to be simple, and nobody's is. But also, don't be naive about, well, we can do anything. See, that today, sometimes I worry about our culture. You know, I think we get some really good people. We don't seem to worry about stuff like that. Oh, sex, whatever, the media, whatever. It's all going to work itself out. No, be careful. There was some real wisdom, even though at times it was too rigid, in the old conservative stuff where, remember my dad would say that to me very often, careful, 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 you know, and there's some wisdom in that, you know. Now it can be overdone where then we become timid and uptight, but we also, it's energy isn't friendly. It's wonderful, the same as electricity. Electricity lights houses. It brings heat, it brings energy. If you touch it wrong, it'll kill you. Divine energy is a lot more powerful than electricity. Now, let's look at that, our struggles. First of all, our constant struggle with inflation and depression. We'll begin with a story. One of the mentors in my life has been Robert Moore, the University of Chicago, who I think is one of the great intelligent writers and so on. And I was at a workshop set, the first time I ever heard him speak. And in the first sentence I was impressed and I thought, I'm going to like this guy, I'm going to listen to this guy. And it was in San Francisco in an auditorium. I was there on sabbatical, and there were about 600 people there. And he began his talk this way on a Friday night. He says, well, he said, if you're in this room, man or woman, and you're more than 25 years old, he said, I suspect that most of you are living in a certain chronic depression. And he said, I don't mean clinical depression, I don't mean a shrink or anything. He said, you're living in a certain chronic depression. He said, and that's not so bad. He said, because most people over 25 who aren't living in chronic depression are jerks. And they're acting out. And he said, you know why you're depressed? Because you're a sensitive person. And you'd sooner live in depression than to be inflated. And then he went on, that the whole weekend was going to be on this. I said, how do you find that fine line between depression and inflation? See, if you're sensitive, and most of us in this room, that's why you're in this room, you're probably sensitive. You probably live with a lot of depression in your life, you know. And that depression partly comes from the fact that you don't want to be a jerk. You don't want to be inflated. You don't want to be full of yourself. You don't want to be saying, she's always full of herself. See, we're so afraid of that and acting out that we'd sooner be half dead and keep the cooling systems on real cold, you know, so that we will never act out. Nobody will ever accuse you of being an egotist. Nobody will ever accuse you of being full of yourself and so on. And so we prefer to live in depression. Then a lot of people don't live in depression. Oftentimes they are full of themselves. And you wish they were depressed. You know, and so what happens, and we get the world divided up with very few exceptions. Precisely, you get the Mother Teresa's and the John Pauls and so on. And the rest of us, we bounce between depression and inflation. We're either too full of ourselves or we're too empty of ourselves. And you know, neither of them is happy. And most sensitive people, we're too empty of ourselves. So we're too empty of this image, not of ourselves, really of God. See, and the great struggle, and I'll talk about this afternoon, that's the great struggle inside of prayer. Prayer is precisely meant to do two things for us. Prayer is meant to ground you deeply in divine energy. It's meant to connect you to divine energy, but at the same time, it's meant to disconnect you both at the same time. You know, I shouldn't say disconnect, it's meant to disassociate you. See, so what a good prayer life does, good prayer, it connects you to the source of divine energy, both God outside and the divine energies inside of yourself. But then it connects you in such a way that you don't identify with the energy. See, Jesus, it's not me, it's the Father who acts in me, all the saints. I do nothing. You know, this is God acting in me. See, whereas the cult leader, they identify, or the person who's a jerk, the person who's full of himself, the egotist, they make that energy their own. It's me, I'm the star. See, then they're identifying with the energy that causes inflations and all kinds of other things. Most of us in this room, our problem is the opposite. We're so afraid of that ever happening to us. That someone says, you know, you are really full of yourself. You're an egotist. We'd wilt and die on the spot, you know. We could hear almost anything other than that, you know. As opposed to people saying, you know something, you're this wonderful person who's never done a thing in her life. Because you've been so afraid of your energy and everything else. Now, you are a wonderful person. You've never hurt a soul, and you never will hurt a soul, but you're never going to do anything great either. Because, you're just so afraid of hurting somebody or being out of line that you're going to live in chronic depression for the rest of your life. You say, well, I'll prefer that to the other option. That's our struggle. And that comes from the grandiosity inside of us. And I say it with sympathy, precisely. It's going to be a struggle. And for most of us who are sensitive, most of the time we're going to make our mistake on the side of caution. We're going to say, I'd sooner be depressed than be seen as an egotist. Okay. And a lot of other people make the other option. I don't care about depression. I want to just access this energy and drive it. And see, that's our struggle. Always depression, inflation. Depression, inflation. We're too high, we're too low. And sometimes you see it in people who suffer from bipolar and so on. It just comes out in them more clearly. They're too high, they're too low. They're up, they're down, they're up, they're down. We are all bipolar, more or less. And that's our great struggle, because we have this powerful energy inside of us that if we ever let loose, it'll blow. It's like Mount St. Helens. It'll blow the lid off. And so we keep it very, very carefully controlled, and sometimes too controlled, or sometimes not controlled enough. That's the struggle. Secondly, our struggle with grandiosity, narcissism, and their children. Grandiosity is more the anthropological word. Narcissism is more the psychological word. They're kind of the same thing. Even inside of our depression, we all struggle immensely with grandiosity and narcissism. What are they? Well, narcissism is a word that Freud gave us, and it's a good word. And he took the Greek myth of Narcissus, which is a wonderful little myth. They say once upon a time there was let me tell you this myth, kind of interesting. Remember, the Greek myths, they contain the psychological wisdom of centuries. Many of these myths are thousands of years old, and they're psychology before we had psychology. So Jung and Freud went back and began to pick up these myths, and there's a lot of wisdom in there. And this is the myth of Narcissus. They said there was a young man called Narcissus who was wonderfully handsome and hale and hardy. He looked like this blonde Greek god, except he was quite humble because he didn't know what he looked like because mirrors hadn't been invented. But there was a nymph goddess who was a nymph called Echo, and she fell in love with him, but he spurned her, and he'd keep moving away from her, and she'd keep calling out, and he'd disappear. So after a while, she pined so much for him that she simply disappeared, and all that was left was her voice, which is an echo. And she's calling out to him. But then the great god Zeus decided to punish Narcissus for his arrogance, and he punished him this way. Narcissus went to drink at a pool, and as he bent down, he saw his reflection in the water, and he was so stunned with his own appearance and reality that he never moved again. He just stayed there and kept looking at himself until he turned into a flower, which has his name, called the narcissus plant. Okay, a little story, and that helped you remember this. But a story told of a young Catholic lad, and he had won a scholarship to some very prestigious Eastern university, let's say Yale, and he's a psychology major, and he's from Montana. He comes back the first Christmas to visit his family, and he went to church with his family. He goes to confession to the priest. And he goes in, he says, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He said, "Father," he said, I would think my biggest sin is the sin of narcissism. Well, the priest hadn't heard this before. He said, "What?" He said, "Narcissism." The priest said, "I know what you're talking about." And the young man said, "See, I'm a psychology major, and Freud gave us that term." And the priest said, "Freud was an atheist. You don't have to bring him into the confessional box." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And the young man said, "Well, Father, see, narcissism is a little like vanity. See, if you're really good looking and you get vain about your looks, and that's my problem. I think I'm really good looking, and so I'm like Narcissus. I kind of get taken with my own appearance." He said, "Do you think it's a sin?" The priest looked at him, he said, "No." He said, "In your case, it's just a mistake." So, okay. But see, Freud uses it, there's an excessive self-preoccupation, which means we're too focused on ourselves. It's kind of my reality, my problems, my heartaches, my headaches, my agenda. And I say this simply, we all struggle with that. We cannot help but not struggle with that, because our reality is so massively real. Remember René Descartes, the great philosopher, the first line of his philosophy, which set up Our modern world comes from that, where Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Descartes was a very pious Christian, went to Mass every day, He's not some egotist. But he's saying, what's real to us? Well, you're inside of your own heart. You're inside of your own mind. You're inside of your own ego, okay? And your reality is real. You may be dreaming everything else. So it becomes hard to accord reality and the same, that everybody else's heartaches are the same as yours. God loves everybody the same as he loves me. That's hard for us to do. It's a stretch because we're real. You're inside of yourself. You feel your pain. You feel your heartaches. You feel your headaches. You feel your joys. That's real. And see, because it's so powerful inside of us. And part of that is grandiosity. Grandiosity means we are grand. There's a goddess inside of you. There's a God inside of you. That's not just ordinary. And certain things can stimulate that. And you feel your self-importance. You cannot help to not feel that. Part of feeling that is healthy. But then it becomes easy to what? Move towards entitlement. Everything I have, I deserve it because I'm bright. I worked for this. It's mine. Sexual entitlement, jealousy, rage, boredom. Those are all feelings that come from our grandiosity. Take rage, for example. I said before, whenever somebody says, I'm just this humble person, I've never done anything, I'm a humble little person, that's always a lie. And whenever someone says that, you'll always find an enraged person underneath. Because, when we feel rage, what happens? You're not being valued properly. When you get really enraged, somebody just puts you down. That triggers rage inside of you, and it should, because they've just put the goddess down, the God down inside of you. Yeah, you're a piece of dirt. You can't hear that because you're not. And something inside of you just rebel. Or boredom. Boredom is, you have all this talent and firepower and artistic power and depth and so on, and I'm stuck in this life and just, I'm have to, take the garbage out this morning. I'm bored with that. See, of course you're going to feel that. Or entitlement. When Jesus warned about the dangers of richness, which is a curious warning, why should riches be dangerous? You would think that poverty should be dangerous. If I don't have food and I don't have, then I should be the one angry at God and I should have a struggle to get into the kingdom. But Jesus says, be careful, riches will exclude you from the kingdom. He said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to go to heaven. Well, why would riches block you? You know why? Not because riches are bad. Poverty's bad. Riches, there's nothing wrong with riches. Riches invariably give us a sense of entitlement. It's mine. See? Whereas in fact, everything is gift. Nothing's mine. Everything's given to us as gift from God, and the poor can recognize that. Remember Jesus said, two groups have a special route to heaven. The poor and little kids. And why little kids? Well, not because, he's not glorifying their innocence. At other points he does, not at this point. What he's saying, what gives little kids access to the kingdom is their powerlessness. See, a little kid, if mom and dad don't get up, it can't even eat. A little kid can't feed itself. See, so kids always know somebody else has to give this to you. See, when we're in the center of our lives and we're healthy and we're strong and we're earning our own money and driving our own vehicles and flying business class, it's hard to accept this is all a gift. Somebody else is feeding me. See, and so that's grandiosity. And it gives us this sense of entitlement. Secondly, our perpetual disquiet and restlessness. And I give you the quote from Rahner. In the torment of the insufficiency of everything attainable, we ultimately learn that here in this life, all symphonies must remain unfinished. Now, we talked about that, but I want to take this one step further. The struggle to be inside of our own skins. You know what? Our grandiosity, which is really the image and likeness of God inside of us, it makes it difficult for us, when I say this perpetual disquiet, to simply be comfortable inside of our own skins. I want to tell you a story. It's a good story. And I think I have this in the book, The Holy Longing, the true story. Some years ago, I was preaching a retreat in Alberta. And the first night, Friday night, we had the opening talk, and I went to my room, and a man knocked on my door, and he says, "Can I talk to you?" And he comes in, And I want to describe this man. He's going to give me a great story. This has been my Pentecost homily ever since, you know. And he came in, he was 48 years old, and he was probably about 60 pounds overweight, mostly around his waist. Bright fellow, and he sits down, and he says, Father, I want to tell you why I came on this retreat. He said, I can't quite articulate it, but I kind of got it now. He said, I'm going through just a major, major thing in my life. He said, and it's this. He said, I'm trying to get inside of my own skin. He said, and it's taken me 48 years to do that. And he told me a story. He said, this is my story. He said, I grew up, he said, in northern Alberta. He said, farm kid, he says, nursing a dream of becoming a professional hockey player. He said, I had this dream that I was going to become a professional hockey player and I was going to play for the Montreal Canadiens. And he said, and I was going to have my name in lights. I was going to have a big contract, a beautiful wife, a big salary, live in a big city. He said, it was my dream. He said, you know something? He said, it almost happened. He said, I was a great star in junior hockey. And junior hockey is like college football. That's where they draft the people. He said, and I was a huge star with the old Edmonton Oil Kings. He said, and I was drafted by Detroit Red Wings. He said, in the first round. He said, so I'm 20 years old, and I went to the Detroit Red Wings camp. You know, he's 48 now, so do the math on that. That's 28 years ago. And he said, but within 2 years, I played in their minor system, but in 2 years they told me, you're never going to make it. You're a little bit too small, and you're a little bit too slow. And he said, so I went back to my little town, and he says, I didn't want to play minor hockey because there's no money in that and whatever. He said, but I was also a big star. I was just this kind of, he said, everybody walked in my aura. He said, so when I began working in the local Safeway store, you know, stacking shelves, I'm 20 years old, I'm a hero. He said, and I married my high school sweetheart. He said, you know something? He said, now this is 28 years later. He said, and in a certain sense, my life has been really good. He said, my marriage has turned out really well. He said, I've had a great marriage. He says, I'm still working the Safeway store. He said, now I'm not stacking shelves. I've worked my way up. I have a pretty good job. He said, I have 2 kids. He said, a daughter and a son. He said, they turned out really well. He said, they're both in college. He said, I'm really proud of them. And he said, and my house is paid for. I'm healthy. My wife is healthy. The kids are healthy. Everything's healthy. He said, but you know something? He says, I've wasted these 28 years. He said, I've never been inside of my own skin. So during these 28 years, he said, I was always saying to myself, if only, hang on to those words. Those are the great unpaschal words, if only. If only I'd made the National Hockey League. If only I wasn't stuck in this small town. If only I wasn't working in a grocery store. If only, I had a big salary. And he said, it's a joke. He said, look at me. He says, I wanted to be big time, big city, big salary, big everything. He said, the only thing that's big about me is the size of my waistline. He said, that's turned out big time. He said, not everything else is not very big at all. He said, and it changed. He said, you know what triggered? He said, my daughter was home recently. He said, and she was reading in church, just doing the reading. He said, and I was really proud. I was looking at her and I thought, it's a shame. He said, it's pathetic. I'm her father, and I've never really been her father the way I should be. He said, because I'm not inside of my own skin. So I got tears in my eyes. I thought, I got to change my life. This is ridiculous. He said, I got this wonderful life, but I'm not inside of my life. Notice his line? I have this wonderful life, but I have never been inside of it. He said, you know why? He said, because I've been nursing this daydream, if only. And he said, I'm pathetic. He said, or I have been up to now. He said, I'm a 48-year-old man. He said, I used to collect autographs. He showed me an autograph of Kenny Rogers and Mark Messier and so on. He says, a 48-year-old man, and the highlight of my years to get an autograph and show it to the guys at work. Look at that, I got Kenny Rogers' autograph at some rock concert. He said, it's pathetic when you think about it. He just threw those things across the room. He said, I got to be inside of my own skin. He said, there must be men who are 48 years old, 48 pounds overweight, living in small towns who are happy, and I want to be one of them. Notice, see, his restlessness. He just put it so well. It's taken me outside of my own skin. That is the story of millions and millions of men and women. We have great lives, but we're not inside of those lives because we're dreaming somebody else's life. I use it for a Pentecost homily because, in Pentecost, oftentimes the second reading is from St. Paul, and he has this ringer of a wonderful line in there where Paul says, the Holy Spirit comes to us not generically, but in a very particular way for our particular state in life. See, God's Spirit is not given to us generic Holy Spirit. It's given to a 48-year-old man who's 45 pounds overweight in a small town working in a grocery store for him, which is different than the Spirit that's given to Brad Pitt and to somebody else. See, if we receive the Spirit for our own lives, we can be inside of our own lives. But it's the struggle. Notice, where does the struggle come from? It comes precisely from the fact that he is in God's image and likeness. To get all this firepower, he wants to be a God on the planet. And didn't work out. But he's on the right track. He says, now everything, I gotta be inside of my own skin. That's what he said. I have a great life, but I need to get inside of that life. We all have good lives, but there's many times we're not inside of our own lives. Okay. The example I gave you earlier today, we spend 98% of our life waiting for something else to happen to us, which means that part isn't so fruitful. I'm just waiting for it to be over with, to get to the next moment. Well, we only have so many moments of our lives. We don't want to have 98% of them. I don't want to be here. I want to be some other place. Now, fourthly, our struggle for faith and to believe in God. See, the irony is the very fire inside of us that's godly is what makes it harder for us to believe in God. Why is that? I'll give you an example here. If you ever get a chance, read this book. It's a wonderful, powerful book. It's a generation old already, but C.S. Lewis's book called The Great Divorce. And divorce here is not a couple getting divorced. It's divorce between heaven and hell inside of ourselves. Okay? And in there, he has 10 interviews where he has people coming from heaven, saints, and they're interviewing people who have just died and inviting them to come to heaven. And most of them turn the saints down. And 2 of those interviews, one is with a great artist and one's with a great intellectual. And neither of them wants to go to heaven. Why? Because they want to talk about heaven, the intellectual, and the artist wants to paint heaven. Okay? See, they're precisely because their creativity feels so godly, it's hard for them to admit that it's not them, it is God. That's my next point. That's why artists and creative people struggle mightily. Most great artists and most great writers and great creative people, they struggle. They struggle in their lives. And I try to name their struggles here. And they struggle precisely because they're so highly attuned to their creativity. They're so highly attuned to their creativity that it's so easy for them to identify with it. What are their struggles? Let me name them and then we'll go through them. The struggle to remain grounded and not identify with the energy. The struggle for faith. The struggle with sexuality. The struggle with entitlement. The struggle with addictions. The struggle with pathological disquiet. The struggle simply with normality. And the struggle with suicide. That's in artists, and it's there in spades. It's a couple of examples, and then I'll try to unpackage these. I remember seeing an interview way back, 30 years ago, with Janis Joplin. Well, more than 30 years because she's been dead more than 30 years. But anyway, powerful interview. She was a rock star. Have you ever seen the movie The Rose? It's lightly based on her story and so on. But she was this powerful creative artist who died at age 27, just fell apart. Didn't commit suicide, she just died from lack of sleep and lack of proper eating and drugs and alcohol, and just eventually killed her. Okay? But she's a very bright woman, and also a woman who radiated powerful energy on the stage. But she would really take her creativity to edges. I don't know how true it is, but they say sometimes before she'd go on stage, she'd take a number of drugs, and then she'd drink an entire bottle of Southern Comfort whiskey. Then she'd go out and she'd just electrify the arena, Now, see, that's an artist, just trying to channel and mediate divine energy. But I saw an interview with her once. She was a very bright woman. Someone said to her, "What's it like being a rock star?" She said, "Well, it's really hard." She said, "People aren't there. You have no idea how hard this is." She says, "I go up on a stage at night and I make love to 50,000 people, and I'm supposed to go home and sleep alone?" Get that? I go out and make love to all these people. What that does is it powerfully stimulates the grandiosity, the divine energy. What do you do with that? How do you ground that energy? What happens is they go up there on stage, and it's true a lot of our athletes and so on, and they're adulated. They're worshipped like gods and goddesses. That changes your energy. It just puts you on fire inside. Like Janis Joplin says, "How do I go home for that?" I go out and I generate this energy, and 50,000 people love me. So I make love to them. They make love back. Then I go home. I can't do anything with this energy. I got to stay up all night. I drink. I fall apart. See, that's truly the struggle of the artist. It's not simple. And all artists, and there's an artist inside of each of us. That's the struggle. Precisely, the more you do connect. That's why creative people It's not, well, they have success and it goes to their heads and then they get too big for their britches and they fall apart. That's kind of one narrative to it. They do get too big for their bridges, but how? What happens is they start out, and oftentimes they're good people, and all this adulation and their own creativity, they're channeling divine energy. They feel like God. They get worshipped like gods and goddesses. And Jesus handled that well. A lot of the rock stars and athletes don't handle it very well at all. Not because they're bad people. They don't know how to handle that, you know. And I don't even want to use contemporary examples, but some of the contemporary examples, everything from Britney Spears to Justin Timberlake or whatever. These were young kids rocketed onto stages, where they're worshipped like gods. How did they carry that? You need a lot of maturity. Jesus could carry that, But in general, artists, what do they struggle with? Precisely to remain grounded. Just go home and do the laundry. So after I'm going to give you an example of just a great, great talk I heard once from Mordecai Richler, who was a great writer, telling young writers how to stay grounded and the importance of staying grounded. Or Kathleen Norris, more recently, has written wonderfully on this. How do you become a writer and how do you stay grounded? Because a lot of times, precisely to the degree that you become successful, it's going to kill you. It's going to turn you into a different kind of person who's going to struggle with your faith. It's no accident. A lot of artists and stuff struggle with church and faith and so on. Struggle with their sexuality. Why? Well, see, that's sexual entitlement. God makes love to the planet. And when you feel like God, you feel you have a right to make love to the planet. Okay. Or with entitlement, with addictions. It's no accident. A lot of artists and stuff have huge, huge addictions. Why? Well, because when you're in touch with godly energy, God is entitled to the whole planet. So to the extent that you have, in fact, that's the root of all your addictions. If you're a scotch drinker, you don't want a glass of scotch. You want to drink all the scotch in the whole world. It belongs to you. It's yours, If you're a sexual addict, you want to make love to everybody on the whole planet. Because that's what God does. See, the more we become attuned to our creative and divine energies, the more we're going to struggle. And so what you see act out in artists' lives, and we should have some sympathy for that. So, well, this person finally fell, and bravo, they got what they had coming to them, Well, sometimes it's easy for us to be unsympathetic about, young stars who got spoiled and had millions of dollars and are in rehab when they're 16 years old and so on. We should be able to think a little deeper and sometimes have sympathy. This person's almost a victim. They weren't ready for this. See, their very energy is what did them in. Okay. And then you can take some consolation in the fact that you and I were these ordinary, solid people. We're never going to write a great novel or a great musical piece or something, but you're probably going to be a pretty sane, decent, balanced person, which is oftentimes why artists precisely deliberately let go of their sanity and balance, because they realize, I'm never going to write the great book, I'm never going to do the great piece, unless precisely I let go of my weirdness. It's no accident that a lot of great artists, let's take a great pop artist, any other great pop artist, Michael Jackson, he's weird as a stick with one end, but that's exactly, he is a great artist. He can generate an energy or a dancer like nobody on the planet. Now, what his sanity is like on a given day, I don't know, but he's a great artist, and you and I are usually in reverse. We are really sane. We are grounded and solid, and we wear heavy shoes, and we walk solidly, and we're never going to, be Michael Jackson, and we're never going to be this, we're never going to be Picasso or whatever, or Doris Lessing, It's a price we pay, but I just want you to look at artists, and you see that struggle in their lives. That's a struggle with divine grandiosity. That's the image and likeness of God, because all creativity comes out of that. Every Hollywood film, every rock star, every symphony composer, every artist, every dancer, that's divine energy, you see. That's coming out of the image and likeness of God, and so on. And sometimes the more we attune to the energy, the greater our problems. Okay, lastly, and we'll wind down on this, and I've kind of said it, we struggle with the various energies, and they're imperialistic. See, these energies, it's kind of what I said before, and I said, the energy isn't friendly. That it's hard to get energy turned on. It's even harder to get it turned off. You know, read the early struggles of Thomas Merton before he went to the monastery. Later on, he was able just to get the maturity to cope with those struggles. But before Merton went to the monastery, he was a 20-some-year-old man, and he was dying. He was literally, physically dying because he was just full of creativity and juice, and he couldn't sleep anymore. He couldn't eat properly anymore. He'd spend his night in jazz clubs. He smoked all night and drank all night, and he couldn't eat, and he had holes in his stomach. And he went to a monastery to save his life. You know, he says, something to ground me, because these energies, they take you. You see it in kids. You see it at every level. You know, from the little kid who's hyper, he's overtired, and for that reason he can't sleep. He just keeps acting on and on and on till he collapses somewhere. To the teenager who it's Friday night and you're lonely, and you know by going to this party and driving around all night in a pickup truck you're going to be more lonely, but you can't stop yourself and you do it anyway. To the countless times where our energies drives us, energy just pushes us. But that's our divine energy. That's our great struggle. It's also the root of all our greatness. I want to read you a poem by Annie Sexton, the poet, who tragically ended up suicide. But a powerful woman, powerful mind, and this is one of her spiritual pieces called The Awful Rowing Towards God. Annie Sexton. Let it go, let it come. I was stamped out into this world like a Plymouth car fender. First came the crib with its glacial bars, then dolls and my devotion to their plastic mouths. And then there was school, with straight little rows of chairs, and me blotting my name over and over. But underneath all that time, a stranger whose elbows wouldn't work. Then there was life in cruel houses, with people who seldom touched, though touch is everything. But I grew. I grew like a pig in a trench coat. I grew. And there were many strange apparitions, nagging rain, the sun turning into poison, and all that time saws cutting through my heart. But I grew. And God was there like an island that I had not yet rowed to. And me, ignorant of God, kept my arms and legs working. Oh yes, I grew. I wore jewelry, I bought tomatoes, and now in midlife, but about 19 in my head, I'd say, I am rowing. I am finally rowing towards God. Though the oarlocks stick and are rusty, and the sea blinks and rolls like a worried eyeball, but I am rowing, though the wind pushes me back. And I know the island will not be perfect. It will have the flaws of this life and the absurdities of the dinner table, but there will be a door. There will be a door, and I will open it, and I will get rid of the rat inside of me, that gnawing, pestilent rat, because God will take it in his two hands and God will embrace it. This, as an African would say, is my story, which I've now told to you. If it be sweet, if it be not sweet, it still ends with me still rowing. Amen.